Hello, welcome back, and today we're going to be talking about strongholds, but this time we're going to be covering it from within the church. I thought I'd open up today with a transition between the previous weeks and this week by tying together what defines a cult. Now, while I was in college, one of my final projects was to define what cults are, and I was excited to dive back into that sort of research. And it was to draw the distinctions between a cult and a religious movement that is legitimate. There are many signs as to what creates a cult: an unwavering loyalty to an infallible, fantastical leader, opposition to wrongthink, the adoption of specialized language, isolation from ex believers and criticism, a rejection of orthodox biblical teaching, a belief in New Age knowledge, and a group using secret or New Age rites. They employ techniques such as love bombing, making people feel as if they're in the inner circle, and making use of weaponized guilt in order to associate their falling short of a standard. All the literature that I read at the time indicated that not any one of these things is useful in determining whether or not it's a cult. It indicated, however, that it takes a great deal of discernment to determine what a movement is. While a lot of the movements that we've gone over the last couple of weeks exhibit a lot of these signs that indicate that they are cults, you would have a very difficult time telling people that they are. In fact, I wouldn't even consider them cults in a lot of situations. That doesn't mean that these movements aren't problematic, and it doesn't mean that they aren't in error. Many people have an idea as to what a cult should look like, and we often think of Jonestown or Waco. And I think that's an unfortunate viewpoint. I think we do ourselves a disservice by considering cults as such. We have a difficult time seeing ourselves being swept away by a movement like that, and we wish to dissociate ourselves, thinking that it's not possible for us to fall down a path like that. But again, I'd be hesitant to call those ideological strongholds cults. It doesn't mean that they aren't problematic, but bottom line, it takes discernment. Today, we're going to be looking at the movements from within the church. We're going to be looking at the book Counterfeit Kingdom, right here, which covers the New Apostolic Reformation, or NAR. I very highly recommend reading this book. It covers, as I'll call it for the rest of the video, NAR, specific examples of false teaching and false prophecy, figures from within the movement, some of its very specific problematic beliefs, and so on and so forth. All that being said, my goal here is not to cover this specific movement per se, or even the book. Rather, I intend to highlight what we should look out for and what to avoid. This is why I brought up cults from the beginning. Much in like that scenario, we must be discerning. Here, my goal isn't to highlight simple differences in doctrine, how people worship, how people come to believe, or the work that people do that happen to be different than my work. I tend to be a lot more open about these things, and I think a lot of the noise and criticism can really get lost in that. I'm far less interested in all the speculative differences. I'm more interested in what is actually an error and how that affects the church today. First, in broad terms, what is the New Apostolic Reformation? In short, it presents itself as the next branch of Christianity beyond Orthodoxy, Catholicism, or Protestantism. They believe that we are in a new apostolic age, or a newly rediscovered spiritual age. There's a leadership-centric movement here that features many names and many faces that places a heavy emphasis on apostles, prophets, miracles, and new revelation. Its center is on the fantastical, the performative, and even the self. If it sounds a little bit New Age, that's because it is a little bit New Age. Let's begin with apostolic authority. Within NAR, since there is a new spiritual age, church leaders within that movement are apostles and have been given ultimate governing authority. This authority places themselves among the 12 apostles in the New Testament, and that's how important these figures are within this new movement. This church is to unify behind the apostles, and they have final say because they have been given final authority on earth to carry out God's will. These are the people who own the keys to the kingdom in their movement. Already, this is problematic, for there must be a distinction between the apostles who witnessed Christ's resurrection and those who claim that same authority today. At the same time, this places no accountability towards the leadership. Paul himself wrote in Galatians, "But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, a curse be on him. As we have said before, I now say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, a curse be on him." The emphasis here is that Paul, who was an apostle, was still under the authority of the gospel. The power isn't placed on the authority of the office to reorganize the church, but rather the authority is under Christ. Chapter 3 begins with the header, and I quote, "Hogwarts for Christians." This is a bold statement, but this was even used by the believers themselves, and it highlights their belief regarding spiritual practices. They were teaching themselves how to acquire this spiritual gift, in this case it was prophecy. It's an attempt to activate the spiritual. This resembles New Age beliefs in which they discover latent and underlying secret knowledge of the self, if that doesn't sound familiar, right? But I would say that this covers more than just NAR, and I'd like to take this opportunity to say that under no circumstances are New Age or occult practices acceptable. They are forbidden within the Bible. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not imitate the detestable customs of those nations. No one among you is to sacrifice his son or daughter in the fire, practice divination, tell fortunes, interpret omens, practice sorcery, cast spells, consult a medium or a spiritist, or inquire of the dead. Everyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord, and the Lord your God is driving out the nations before you because of these detestable acts. Specifically with prophecy, we are to use caution in finding out false teachers and preachers. If anyone tells you then, "See, here's the Messiah," or "Over here," do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. The gift of prophecy can be legitimate, and God can work through it. So how do we discern between true teaching and false teaching? According to chapter 4 of the book, we must again be discerning. Are the prophecies in alignment with Scripture? Is the person who claims to be a prophet living in accordance to Scripture and living the Christian lifestyle? And are they getting the prophecy itself correct? But the prophet who presumes to speak a message in my name that I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet must die. You may say to yourself, how can we recognize a message the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the Lord's name, and the message does not come true or is not fulfilled, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. Do not be afraid of him. There are many within the NAR movement who have claimed to have had real prophecies and yet are wrong. Even being wrong once is a disqualifier. Others yet give generalized prophecies that are entirely vague so they couldn't be wrong. They include loopholes and qualifiers in order to cover up mistakes. They often have to resort to either using cold readings or hot readings, as well as other mentalist tricks in order to generate prophecy. Others yet contend that the scriptures don't apply to these modern day prophets, going against the true teaching of Scripture. Their authority, yet again, trumps what God has to say on the subject. Within NAR, there is a huge emphasis on dominion, or the missional aspect of what believers are called to do. In my opinion, this is really downplayed in the book. They have the 7 mountain mandate, which means that believers should seek to regain power of these 7 institutions: family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government. When this is done, and believers recapture all of these institutions, this will cause the end of history as Christ will make his return. With this, I think it's very important that we talk about the true aspects of everything that was just mentioned. First, it goes without saying that we are the salt of the earth, and that's part of my channel name, Salty Servant, right? We are to go out and boldly proclaim the gospel to all aspects of life. This includes these 7 institutions, but it doesn't exclude anything either. It's God working through us, not the office and influence that we have. For Jesus didn't call solely people who are rich and powerful towards his ministry, and it didn't limit him from calling people like Matthew to ministry either. Brothers and sisters, consider your calling. Not many were wise from a human perspective, not many powerful, not many of noble birth. Instead, God has chosen what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God has chosen what is insignificant and despised by the world, what is viewed as nothing, to bring to nothing what is viewed as something, so that no one may boast in his presence. That might seem like a minor point, but it highlights the bigger issue here with dominionism. There's a distinct shift in focus away from making disciples and proclaiming the gospel, and instead we go ahead and name and claim. The focus again goes away from Christ and onto ourselves, as it's our responsibility to go further beyond what we are called to do in stewardship and for us to take over society. This would make God's return entirely contingent on our mandate. There's so many more examples and so much more that I could cover, and I believe that I've covered some of the most erroneous and most important topics. However, I would encourage anyone that hasn't heard of this movement before or hasn't read the book, go ahead and do some research on your own for sure, because there's a lot of stuff that I didn't cover, and this is a real interesting movement to look into. And again, it all comes down to discernment, because not everyone is fully on board with all of this other stuff. This is just a lot of the core teaching within one of the churches that follows it. There are many concerns with NAR as a whole, but among the largest themes that I've repeated constantly throughout this video is that it takes a much lesser view of the divinity of Christ, and that there is an elevation of the self. Among a lot of the other various issues, there is a high regard for specialized knowledge within this movement, as there are new prophetic visions that supersede biblical truth. Having the role of either the apostle or the prophet grants authority and creates a specialized class of individuals who are in the inner circle. New Age practices are embraced. There is an adoption of codified language that people in the know understand. There's isolation from people who defect. At this point, I think you understand exactly what I'm going for here. All of that being said, I wouldn't necessarily classify this movement as a cult, just as I wouldn't necessarily classify it as a false consciousness. It doesn't have a smooth fit, even though there's all of the commonalities there. The danger of NAR doesn't stem from the fact that it's an alternative movement that brings a challenge to the Christian faith. But I will call it a stronghold, and one that is extremely demoralizing to the church. Like a Trojan horse, it has the ability to bring in many people and lead people to become very spiritual, especially claiming that churches outside of its reach are spiritually dead. It convinces people of the fantastical. It's reaching young people and teaching them the alternative way, one that improperly empowers their egotism as a moral good. It's spiritually permissive without being properly centered on Christ, but rather the self. When everything falls apart, instead of leadership taking accountability, people instead believe that the gospel is to blame. Outside onlookers look at the worst excesses of this faith and are convinced that this movement is representative of gospel teaching. They see a God that is not all-powerful, but a people who overrule God and place themselves as the protagonist, centering the self. That being said, we're going to continue this next week, and after that, we're going to cover Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life, which this whole entire series has been building towards. So I'm super excited for that. Until then, God bless and stay salty.